Welcome back, folks. I'm Frizz, and today I'd like to take some time to talk about movement in Pathfinder 2e, and just how important it can be. I've said multiple times on this channel before that you should never underestimate mobility, and while I haven't said it nearly as much, it's also surprisingly important to consider enemy mobility and how you can screw over their mobility, and also how they can screw over yours. So let's get into it. Movement is obviously important for lots of characters, but it can take a bit of time to sink in why movement is even more important in Pathfinder 2e than other systems, especially if you came from those other systems. Primarily, this is because every creature is incapable of making attacks of opportunities, which means that you can move around way more frequently without getting the snot beaten out of you. Seeing as people can move more due to not getting swatted whenever they move, they're going to be moving more. And then that means that, moving further with every action is going to go a lot further in 2e when compared to other systems, because, you're moving more. For example, having at least a decent movement speed is super important for characters who want to be in melee. If you've got the standard movement speed of 25 feet, then it'll take you 2 actions to get into melee with a character who's just 30 feet away. If you've got a 5-foot boost to your speed from, let's say, the fleet general feat, then you will save 1 action, and I assure you, being 30 feet away from an enemy is going to happen a ton throughout the course of a campaign, so you're going to save a lot of actions. Also, you never know when that extra 5 feet of movement is exactly what you're going to need to get into a flank and dramatically increase your odds of dealing damage. Of course, mobility is important for everyone, not just people who want to run towards danger. After all, running away from people is always an option, and one that I actually do recommend a lot for people who, don't want to be standing next to danger. If you're a squishy backliner running away from an enemy, being fast is obviously going to be useful, but it's actually better than you most likely realize. If you've got a 30-foot speed and your opponent has a 25-foot speed, then you have the ability to stride away as an action and force your opponent to spend 2 actions to get next to you. And that can be done every single turn. Small bonuses to mobility are basically always going to be useful, as long as you try and think of ways to use them. As I said earlier, never underestimating mobility is important, but simultaneously, never underestimating the power of ruining other people's mobility is also really important. A simple spell that creates difficult terrain might not seem immediately useful when compared to just dealing damage, but if a creature actually has to move somewhere, then it can be an absolute nightmare for them. This is what makes something like Scatter Scree an incredibly useful cantrip. Like, if you look at Entangle, it's a very simple spell, but it gets way, way better if you can place it so that it turns 40 feet of movement into effectively 80 feet of movement for an enemy. It'll potentially give you a whole nother turn just to deal with whatever threat you're dealing with, and you can do a lot with a whole turn. This can get even more powerful once you start mixing in the other ways of movement. After all, not every creature is going to have the ability to fly, or they're not going to be trained in athletics or acrobatics. So putting something as simple as like a wall or a bit of water between you and an enemy can make things way, way more difficult for them. For example, take Wall of Water. To get through a wall of water, you've got to stride next to it, then take an action to swim through it, which will require an athletics check, and then stride once you're onto the other side. If you're not trained in athletics, you also don't have a great strength, then you might actually fail whenever you're trying to swim. It's a great spell that can have crazy amounts of utility, like making an enemy spend 3 actions to go 20 feet. And really, you get all of that just by messing with how enemies are able to move. Another fun example was actually shown off as part of the Water Kineticist. You're going to have an impulse that'll just freezes the ground around them, which requires everyone, except for the Kineticist, to use the balance action to move, or else they automatically fall prone. While the DC for balancing is pretty low at just a static 15, not every monster has acrobatics, and it actually stops everybody, no matter what, from being able to use the step action or use abilities like sudden charge to run up and hit you. Messing with the environment to make movement more difficult is honestly one of the best ways to defend yourself and control crowds in the entire system. Naturally, how PCs are able to use this to their advantage is a bit limited. Marshals honestly can't do all that much to make enemies' movement worse, and spellcasters can easily do way more, but even they are limited by what spells they know and what spells even exist in the system. GMming is where this whole concept really thrives. Creating an encounter where the party's mobility is compromised is a great way to make your players think and come up with new strategies, or find creative ways of using their pre-existing abilities. Seriously, you would not imagine how much more challenge is added into a combat just by making the frail wizard climb a damn ladder. Designing combats with interesting and potentially challenging environments for mobility is a blast, and I highly recommend it. As a player, those combats are easily some of my favorites. There's a lot going into utilizing your own mobility and screwing over other people's mobility. And honestly, I've hardly touched any of it in this video. Mobility is an obscenely versatile tool that can be used in basically every situation so long as you're willing to get creative. And I have a blast trying to use it as much as I can, but I can't go into exact details because, how you use mobility is going to depend greatly on the actual terrain you're in, so I can't go over literally every situation. I guess my main concrete tip for players is that if you want to have a good mobility, the athletic skill is your friend. Using quick jump to jump over difficult terrain is hilariously effective because it basically means that you can ignore it, and climbing literally anything is always fun and surprisingly useful. Long story short, never underestimate the power of mobility. Thanks for watching. Having absurdly mobile characters is honestly just a trait of mine at this point. As of recording this, one of my PCs climbed straight up towards a horrifying clockwork spider and is only somewhat regretting his decision. But what are your thoughts toward movement and mobility in Pathfinder 2e? Do you have a favorite way to screw over other people's moves? Let me know in a comment down below, and while you're down there, you can always subscribe if you want to and join the channel as a member. My members help me out loads. But regardless, until I see you next, live a wonderful life.